I've come to Perth to address a couple of meetings over the next few days, primarily around the issue of TAFE funding and with a focus on what's happening nationally with funding to the TAFE system, but also we've been presented, I think, with a fairly unique opportunity in TAFE, in as much as the agenda of both the agendas around TAFE funding that are emerging from both the Commonwealth and some state governments up until now have been fairly abstract agendas, in the sense that they've just been focused on cost cutting and reducing funding to the sector. Whereas what's happened is that in one state, in Victoria, one state government chose to be fairly aggressive, if you like, well, aggressive I think is probably the right way to describe it, in its implementation of a reform process a couple of years ago, and it fully implemented what is now referred to as a demand-driven funding system in Victoria in 2008, several years ahead of any other of the state governments. And really it anticipated the rollout of federal government reforms, which are now being required of all state governments as a condition of federal funding. I say that's an advantage, and it's really the way I've described it up until the last month or so when I've gone around the country, because what Victoria presented us with is a working model of what would happen to TAFE funding across the country if other states chose to go down the path that Victoria has, and if other states implemented the sort of reforms which are now required of state and territory governments through the Commonwealth funding agreement. So what I'm doing is I'm basically going around the country and I'm saying to states and territories, you are now required as a condition of Commonwealth funding to look at the way in which your funding is organised for TAFE. In particular, as a result of the most recent COAG agreement, you're required to implement an entitlement for students up to Certificate 4. You're required to implement income contingent loans, and you're required to make your TAFE funding systems more competitive than they currently are. Now, all of those things, all states and territories have signed up to as of April 13th. And what I'm arguing is that this will have really serious consequences for the TAFE system in West Australia if this is the path that the government chooses to go down. And I say this because we can now look to what's happening in Victoria and see what has happened to TAFE provision and see what has happened to TAFE colleges as a result of the implementation of entitlement funding models, income contingent loans, and basically the opening up of all government funding for competition from both public and private providers. So basically what's happened in Victoria in a matter of 2 years is that in 2008, 75% of vet delivery in Victoria was undertaken in TAFE colleges. So 75% in 2008, 2 years after their reform process had commenced, 48% of TAFE of delivery of vet in Victoria is now undertaken in TAFE colleges. All of that delivery that was once provided through TAFE has now been shifted to private providers. So in 2008, 14% of TAFE of vet delivery in Victoria was in the private system. In 2000, at the end of last year, in 2011, 40% of vet delivery in Victoria was conducted through private providers. In that same period, we've had a growth in private provision, and the number of private providers has doubled and in some almost trebled. So you've gone from less than 200 private providers who were accessing government funding in Victoria in 2007. Now there are more than 500 private providers actively competing with TAFE colleges for access to government funds. Now, by the end of last year, the 18 TAFE colleges in Victoria who had previously been amongst the most commercially oriented and financially successful TAFE institutes in the country, notwithstanding the fact that Victoria is one of the lowest funded states in the country in respect of TAFE funding. Nevertheless, at the beginning of 2008, the 18 TAFE institutes in Victoria all had a budget surplus, all were operating in a healthy financial environment, and all were doing very well. By the end of 2010, only 2 TAFE institutes, 2 out of the 18 in Victoria, had a budget surplus. The rest were all operating in deficit. So by the end of 2010, the situation in Victoria had turned around. Not only had TAFE lost market share, its budgetary situation had declined considerably. Now, as I said to you at the beginning of this presentation, when I first started going around talking about what was happening in Victoria and using it as an example, and if you like, as a warning for other states and territories about how they should consider and how cautiously they should consider these sorts of reforms, I did so because I think that we did have a working example of what could happen, and it did serve as a warning. What's happened in Victoria in the last month has been absolutely devastating. On top of the changes to the organisation of TAFE and the reduction in funding that had occurred over the last two years, the incoming Liberal government, a year into its term, has absolutely slashed TAFE funding much further. And in fact, what it's done is removed any of the differential in funding rates between TAFEs and private providers, removed TAFE's full service delivery funding, and basically what it's done is just thrown TAFE out and said, you are just like any other private provider, you're like any other provider, you will have will have none of the funding support that governments have previously afforded to TAFE. TAFE in Victoria has just become like any other RTO. There is little doubt in my mind that a number of state governments around the country are considering exactly the same sort of reform process as has unfolded in particular, and WA is absolutely one of those states. As recently as about 12 to 18 months ago, the West Australian government it commenced the process of reform by allocating, I understand, 50% of its government funding for competition from private and public providers. And it's as clear as it could be that this is the first stage of the West Australian government considering exactly the same reform process as the Victorian government did.